What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafter Workshop video. In this week's video, I'm going to show you how to build this really clean, modern, either blanket chest or what we're going to use it for, a big toy box or toy chest. And this is another project in the series I'm doing with Lowe's Home Improvement, who is the sponsor of this week's video. And I'm trying to make all of these projects really approachable and projects that you don't have to have a ton of tools for. So this one was a bit of a step up. This whole cabinet is made of solid red oak and the base is made of solid poplar. So it is a nice all solid wood project, should last for many, many years. Got some cool features, including this nice lid hardware, which keeps the lid up in any position to keep people's fingers from getting slammed in it. And I just really love the way it came out. So let's go ahead and get started with the project.
This project is made of two different assemblies, the cabinet and the base, and I started by working on the cabinet, which is made from oak 1x8s. I first broke down the boards to rough length at the miter saw, and having some sort of stop block is super helpful here. I was going to trim the panels to final length later anyways, but it makes the glue up a lot easier if the boards are the same length. And there was also a single 1x3 strip which I used for the lid, just to make it wide enough to overhang the front edge of the box. And with all the boards cut to size, I could glue up the panels. And I added some dominoes for alignment, which made things a lot easier during the glue up, and I definitely recommend adding something similar like biscuits or dowels. It'll just save you a lot of sanding later on. Also, if you do have access to a jointer, you'll get a lot tighter joints than trying to just glue up the boards with the factory edges. And a hand plane or straight line jig on the table saw would be helpful if you don't have a jointer. After the glue dried for about an hour, I removed the clamps and scraped off any glue squeeze out, and then let the panels dry for a few more hours. And you can see how flat these panels were right out of the clamps. I barely had to do any sanding to smooth out those glue lines. Next, I needed to trim the panels to final size, and I decided to try this Craig AccuCut circular saw guide, and it worked extremely well. It basically turns your circular saw into a track saw and has an attachment that references the edge of the panel to help keep things nice and square. So I would first trim one end of one of the panels to get it square, and then mark the final length of the panel and cut it to final size. And I made sure to check for square a bunch of times along the way, and just repeated the process for all four cabinet sides as well as the lid. To assemble the cabinet, I decided to use rabbets, which make for an extremely strong carcass and also helps to keep the whole thing square during assembly. And I'd actually never cut rabbets like this using a router. I've always used the table saw, but it was super simple. I used my router table, but a handheld router with an edge guide would work in the exact same way. I just made the cut in 3 passes, removing about 1/8 of an inch on each pass, with the final depth of the rabbet ending up at about 3/8 of an inch. And while I was at it, I went ahead and added a rabbet to the bottom edge of all the pieces to accept the 1/2 inch plywood that I used for the bottom of the cabinet. Before assembly, I needed to cut in the handle cutout on the front of the cabinet. I marked where I needed to cut using a speed square, and then cut to my line using the jigsaw. And it's always kind of surprising how clean of a cut you can get with a jigsaw if you just take your time and let the saw do the work. After cutting the handle, I cleaned up the edges with my random orbit sander, and then I could glue up the cabinet, which was pretty simple due to those rabbets. The pieces just fit right into place, and the whole thing squares itself as long as your rabbets are square. And you might notice that the ends of the front and back pieces are just a little bit proud of the sides of the cabinet, so I needed to clamp around those areas to get everything nice and tight. And I probably went a little bit overboard with the clamps here, but all the joints ended up looking great. After the glue dried, I removed the clamps and then measured for the bottom panel. I used a piece of 1/2 inch oak plywood for the bottom panel and cut it to size using the AccuCut, and you can see how that rubber strip also helps to prevent tear out, which is especially important on plywood like this, which has an extremely thin veneer. Before installing the bottom panel, I went ahead and sanded the whole cabinet up to 120 grit, as it was a lot easier to get inside the carcass without the bottom panel installed. To install the bottom panel, I added some glue to the rabbeted areas, dropped in the panel, and added some 1-inch brad nails just to hold it in place while the glue dried. I also added a few clamps before nailing the panel in place, just to make sure everything was nice and snug. The last piece to add to the cabinet was this center divider, which I really only added because I had a little extra left over from those 1x8 pieces, and I just attached it with 1 1/4 pocket screws. With the cabinet fully assembled, I could start getting it prepped for finish, and I chamfered the bottom edges along with the ends of the cabinet using my block plane, and chamfering the bottom edge will add a really nice reveal between the base and the cabinet and just gives it a super clean look. The last pieces to add before staining were 2 cleats to the underside of the lid. Any solid wood panel of this size is going to be prone to cupping, and adding a cleat like this is just a good insurance policy to help keep that from happening. I attached the cleats with glue and 1¼ screws, making sure to only apply glue to the center of the cleat and to drill oversized holes for the outer screws to allow for wood movement. After adding the cleats, I sanded everything up to 180 grit and then could move on to staining. For the stain, I used this Minwax whitewash pickling stain, which really tones down the color of the red oak, which was exactly what I was looking for, as I'm not a huge fan of red oak's natural color. And the stain is pretty simple to apply. I just applied a heavy coat using a foam brush, making sure to move both with the grain and across the grain to make sure to get the stain down into the open pores of the oak. Then I just let it sit for a minute or so, then wiped off the excess with some shop towels. And this is a water-based stain, so it does dry pretty fast, so it's important to only work on areas you can fully cover in about 3 minutes. I applied 2 coats to the lid and outside of the cabinet, letting the stain dry about 2 hours between coats, and decided to leave the inside of the cabinet unstained just for ease of application. Once the second coat dried overnight, I sprayed on 3 coats of water-based polyurethane to seal the stain, and I used my HVLP system for this, but polyacrylic is available in spray cans, and I really prefer to spray finish over stains as it just helps to keep the stain from running.
All right, while I'm finishing, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Lowe's Home Improvement, and the tool of this week, this DeWalt hammer drill and impact driver combo kit. And this new set has a lot of really cool new features that my old set doesn't. First of all, on this impact driver, it's got 3 different speeds, including this low #1 speed, which is great for driving those little fragile screws, like anytime you're adding hardware to a project. For instance, those piano hinges I'm going to be adding to this toy chest. The drill is nice and powerful. It's got 2 speeds, a high speed for drilling things like wood with smaller bits, and a low speed for drilling things like metal. And one really cool feature is it's got this 3-position LED switch, and on this right position, it'll actually leave this front LED on for about 20 minutes. So if you're working under a sink or in a dark area, you can just pull the trigger a little bit, that light's gonna come on and it's gonna stay on for about 20 minutes. Also, another great thing about DeWalt is that they really value American-made products, and both of these tools are made in the USA with global materials. So if you wanna learn more about this combo kit, check out the link in the video description below, and thanks again to the folks at Lowe's for sponsoring this week's project. Let's get back to it.
With the cabinet finished, I could work on the base, and I built the base out of these Poplar 2x2s, which were really perfect for this project, as they don't have the rounded edges of standard pine 2x2s. I cut the pieces to size at the miter saw, and then added 2 pocket holes to each end of the stretcher pieces, and these pocket holes will be what attaches the stretchers to the legs. Once all of the pocket holes were drilled, I could assemble the base. First, I attached the long stretcher to 2 of the legs, and it's really important to clamp pieces in place when assembling parts using pocket holes, as they'll want to move around otherwise. I used 2.5-inch pocket screws to assemble the pieces, and made sure to orient the pocket holes so that they'd be hidden in the final piece. After assembling both of the long stretcher and leg assemblies, I could attach the short stretcher between them to complete the base. And you'll also notice that I didn't use any glue here, and that's because all these joints are butt joints, meaning in grain to long grain. Glue really wouldn't have added much strength, if any, to these joints, and I figured they didn't need it. After assembly, I could sand the base, making sure to flush up any uneven edges. Next, I chamfered the top edges of the base along with the outside edges of the legs, again using my block plane, and Poplar plane's incredibly easy. It's really satisfying. I also chamfered the bottom edges of the feet, which will help keep the edges from tearing out if the base is dragged across the floor. I decided to paint the base black and use this Krylon black spray lacquer, which ended up working out great. It dried incredibly fast and left me with a smooth, glossy black finish. Really turned out looking awesome. Once the paint dried on the base, I could get it attached to the cabinet. I pre-drilled holes and used 1 3/4 long screws to attach the base to the underside of the cabinet. The last step in this project was to install the lid onto the cabinet, and I used a piano hinge as the main hinge mechanism, which was extremely simple to install. I just pre-drilled some holes using a self-centering drill bit and drove in some screws. To help keep the lid open when getting things out of the toy chest, I decided to add these lid supports, and these hold the lid open and just keep it from slamming shut. It's kind of just a safety measure, especially for kids. And I just followed the instructions that came with the hinges to install them. And with the lid installed, this project was finished.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I'm really happy with the way this whole piece came together. As I mentioned earlier, red oak is not typically my favorite, but I think this whitewash stain really gives it a very clean look, especially with this contrasting black base. I think the whole thing has a really nice modern vibe to it. Really love the way it came out. Also, this lid support hardware is crazy sturdy and strong. I'm really happy with the way that is working. It's actually almost too strong, even with only one of them. This corner wants to lift up ever so slightly, but I think as it breaks in, that's gonna wear in really nicely. But this is gonna be great. Keep any little fingers from getting smashed and that kind of thing. I think it's gonna work out super, super nice. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. If this is your first time to the channel, go ahead and get subscribed. I put out new project videos like this pretty much every week. Also, ring that little notification bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. Also, I do have plans available for this project, so you can check those out. There's a link to those in the video description below. Also in the video description below is links to all the tools and materials I used on this project, all of which are from Lowe's. And last, I have added that YouTube member functionality to the channel. That gives you all kinds of behind the scenes access, so you can get questions answered directly there. It's just a lot of fun. So I'll have a link to that somewhere on the screen as well. So thanks again for watching, everybody, and until next week, happy building.